So far we have been looking at this model of aggregate demand and supply in terms of its two separate components. That is, we first of all built our understanding of the aggregate demand, and then independently we developed our understanding of the country's aggregate supply. Now the goal in this video is to bring together aggregate demand and supply and see how the final form, the complete form of this model looks like. And by bringing together aggregate demand and supply, in this video we'll start learning about the way in which this model of AD and AS tells us about the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, how it is established, and how it may change as macroeconomic conditions change. Now, to understand all of those things, let me first of all start off by quickly giving you a recap of what we know about aggregate demand and separately about aggregate supply, and through that we will extend the analysis, bring the two AD and AS together and start learning about these macroeconomic equilibriums and how they may change and how the model of AD and AS can give us insights into all of that. Now, in terms of a quick recap, remember that we learned that aggregate demand, the sum of CIG and NX, is the total demand for the country's output coming from all the four different sectors of the macroeconomy. And we then learned that the aggregate demand curve tries to tell us about the amount of this aggregate demand that will exist in the country at each of the different possible price levels. And what we learned was that aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, which reflects the fact that there is an inverse relationship between price levels and the amount of aggregate demand for the country's total output. That is, if price levels fall, aggregate demand increases, and if price levels increase, aggregate demand falls. Now, we then concluded our analysis of country's aggregate demand by looking into the factors that can cause a shift or an increase or a decrease of this aggregate demand. And there we learned that it's either natural economic variations such as changes in households and investors' confidence, because of which the consumption and investment part of the aggregate demand may fluctuate and therefore cause the aggregate demand to increase or decrease. And then on the other hand, we learned that the government and the central bank, they have these tools of money supply, interest rate, exchange rate, income tax and government spending in their hand, which they can change, and as a result the aggregate demand will also change. It will either increase or decrease. So that is what we have learned about the aggregate demand curve. On the other hand, as far as aggregate supply is concerned, we learned that aggregate supply is the amount of total output that the firms decide to produce in an economy. And we also learned that in the short run, where the wages in the economy are sticky, then in that short run, the short run aggregate supply curve of an economy is an upward sloping graph, an upward sloping curve, just reflecting the fact that as price levels increase in the short run, if wages are sticky, the total output supplied will also increase. And in terms of the shifts of short-run aggregate supply curve, remember we said that it's either the changes in cost of production or the changes in the quantity and quality of country's resources that can cause an increase or decrease, and therefore a shift right or a shift left of the country's short-run aggregate supply curve. Now here, remember, it is important, and it will become more clear as we move on why this is important, but do remember this thing, that if the cost of production changes, then only your country's short-run aggregate supply curve will be affected, whereas if the quantity or quality of your country's resources or the state of technology changes, then they will affect both the country's potential output, the country's productive capacity, as well as causing a shift in the country's short-run aggregate supply curve. So those are the bits and pieces of what we have already learned about these two separate components, the AD and AS. And once we have all of these bits and pieces, we can now bring the two together, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We can bring them two together, as we have already done in this graphical space, to learn about the two key insights of this model of AD and AS. The first one is that this model, now we will see, allows us to theoretically depict the way in which the macroeconomic equilibrium is established, and then more importantly, as we will learn by the end of this video, once we have the starting reference equilibrium point, we can then start using this model of AD and AS as an analytical tool with which we can work out the impact on the key macroeconomic variables such as price levels, GDP, employment, and incomes as the macroeconomic conditions in the economy change. So let me start off first of all by showing you how this model explains the way in which the macroeconomic equilibrium is established. Now that is really simple, because all this model of AD and AS says is that the macroeconomic equilibrium will be at this point of intersection of the aggregate demand and the country's aggregate supply curve. And at this point of intersection, the price level PL star will be the equilibrium price level that will exist in the economy, and this GDP, which we will call Y star, so Y will be used to denote GDP, this will be the equilibrium GDP that the economy will produce. Now, the way you can sort of prove why this PL star and Y star will be the unique macroeconomic equilibrium is to look at the only two other possibilities, which are that what happens if price levels are, either less than PL star or more than PL star. Now, first of all, let's pick up the case where the price levels are below PL star. So let's call that PLL. So low price levels below PL star. You see, if your price levels are lesser than this equilibrium of PL star, then at these low price levels, the aggregate demand, the sum of CIG and NX coming from the four sectors of the economy, it will be too much because price levels are too low. Whereas these lower price levels mean lower profits for the firms, and therefore the amount of aggregate supply that they will bring in will be much lesser, and that would create this shortage in the macroeconomy. And as a result of this shortage, the price levels will start to increase. They will gravitate towards this PL star, and as price levels increase, the firms will start producing more aggregate supply, and as the price levels increase, the aggregate demand will start falling, and your economy will automatically move back to this equilibrium point where you will get into that same outcome. The equilibrium price level will be PL star and equilibrium GDP will be Y star. Now, the only other possibility is that if price levels are not PL star and if they are not less than PL star, then the only other possibility is that price levels will be more or higher than PL star. Now, this again can't be a stable point. This again can't be an equilibrium, because if price levels are too high, then aggregate demand will be very, very small. Households and businesses and firms and government, they will be discouraged to buy since things will be much more expensive. So you have small amount of aggregate demand. Whereas at these high price levels, the country's aggregate supply will be much more, because higher price levels mean higher profitability, and therefore firms will bring in a large amount of aggregate supply into the economy. Now that would again create an imbalance, and this time the imbalance that will be created will be a surplus of goods that will be produced in the economy. And when nobody buys the surplus of goods, eventually the firms will start lowering the price levels, they will start giving discounts, and therefore you can again sort of see that, whether you start with the price lower than PL star or higher than PL star, there will either be a shortage or a surplus, and therefore the economy will move back. It will gravitate towards this unique equilibrium of PL star, at which point the GDP produced and consumed or demanded will be equal to this Y star. So that is how you can sort of, in this longish way, prove why this point will be the unique macroeconomic equilibrium. Now, once we have that, let me just keep this graph clean and let me just get rid of this proof. And then this theoretical imaginary equilibrium that this model of AD and AS gives you, this is already important, because if you think about it, then this imaginary equilibrium is sort of giving you a snapshot, a view into the entire macroeconomy. Because yes, it is an imaginary equilibrium, but it is telling you about the price level in the country, which is one of the main key economic indicators. And then this equilibrium is telling you about the country's equilibrium GDP, which is of course the key economic indicator, the amount of GDP that a country produces. And in turn, depending on what is this GDP, what is this total output that your country produces, that will determine the amount of total employment in the country, and that employment in turn will determine the amount of total national income that will be generated in the country. So that is where we are saying that this imaginary model is sort of giving you a snapshot a view into the entire macroeconomy. It is telling you about all of these different key macroeconomic indicators. However, just these imaginary indicators, PL star, GDP star, and income star, all of those imaginary things in themselves, they don't mean a lot. But you see, the way we use this model of ADAS, this imaginary starting equilibrium, this is just a starting point. This is just a starting reference point. We just start off by assuming that, okay, economy must be in some sort of an equilibrium. So let's assume that it is where the ADAS intersects. We have theoretically proved why that will be the equilibrium. And then instead of numbers, instead of precise data, we are just talking in terms of these imaginary PL star, GDP star, Y star, so on and so forth. But once we have the starting point, we can then start using this model of AD and AS as an analytical tool with which we can work out how will this PL star and GDP star and therefore employment and income in the economy, how will they change as macroeconomic conditions change. Now, change in macroeconomic conditions simply mean changes in the household's confidence, changes in investor confidence, changes in key macro variables such as interest rates or exchange rates or money supply, or changes in the country's cost of production, changes in the price of oil, or changes in the country's quantity or quality of resources. These are all the things that sort of are changing macroeconomic conditions when these things change. And I'm saying we can start using this model of ADAS as an analytical tool to work out, okay, what will happen to price levels in GDP and employment, let's say, when interest rates in the economy decrease. And the way we use this model of AD and AS is to, again, as I said, start off by assuming that economy must be in some initial equilibrium. Theoretically, that must be at the point where the AD and AS intersect. Now, if you want to work out how will a decrease in interest rate impact your macroeconomy and how will that change your macroeconomic indicators, all you need to do is to recall that we have already learned that when interest rates fall, the cost of borrowing in the economy falls, and therefore households and firms, they will start borrowing more, and therefore they will start consuming and investing more, which, remember, we used to learn that if interest rates fall, because of all of this reasoning, the aggregate demand in the economy will increase. Now, if you want to work out, okay, what will happen to the key macro indicators when interest rates are falling, you just need to come back to this graph starting from this assumed equilibrium. Just shift your aggregate demand, increase it. And just read from this graph that, look, if interest rates fall, aggregate demand will increase. I have shifted my aggregate demand, and that will show you that, look, the GDP, employment and income in your economy will increase, whereas the price levels in your economy, they will also increase if you lower the interest rates. And there you have your answer as to how interest rates will impact the key macroeconomic indicators. The GDP will increase, the employment will increase, the national income will increase. So therefore your economy overall will expand, it will grow when you lower the interest rates. However, the price levels will also increase, meaning that you will have to suffer from some amount of inflation. Now you see, if you change money supply, if you increase it, again the impact, the way you work it out will be the same. Increase in money supply will cause an increase in aggregate demand. So you again start off with an assumed imaginary equilibrium of PL star and Y star, and if money supply is increasing, just shift your aggregate demand, increase it, take it to the right, and read off from this graph how the macroeconomic indicators will be affected. The same thing applies to, let's say, if income tax rates are lowered. If you have to work out the impact on the macroeconomy, just remind yourselves, income tax, when they are reduced, then the household's disposable incomes increase, so therefore they start consuming more, and therefore your country's aggregate demand will increase. So start off with an initial assumed equilibrium, increase your aggregate demand, and read off from this graph that income tax, if you lower them, your GDP, employment, incomes will increase, but you will have to suffer from some inflation. Now, obviously, you can apply the same logic to government spending. If it increases, aggregate demand will increase, and you can just use this exact same analysis to work out that, look, this is what will happen to GDP, employment, income, and this is what will happen to price levels if you increase the government spending in the economy. Now, obviously, aggregate demand, it can also shift to the left. So if you, let's say, lower the money supply or increase the interest rate or appreciate the exchange rate or increase the income tax or lower the government spending, all of these things mean that aggregate demand would fall, it would shift to the left. So to work out the impact on the macroeconomy of either of these changes, a reduction, or let me write this down, a reduction in money supply, an increase in interest rate, an increase in exchange rate, an increase in income tax, or a lowering of government spending. Now we have already learned in detail that if you change these variables in this particular direction, then all of this would mean that the country's aggregate demand would fall. It would shift to the left. So starting off with this imaginary equilibrium of PL star and Y star, you just shift your aggregate demand to the left and read off from this graph that look, your GDP, employment and income will fall, and the price levels in the economy, they will also fall if either of these changes in these variables take place. So overall, the message therefore is that look, you just start off by imagining an assumed equilibrium, PL star, Y star, and then you just need to work out whether these changes in macroeconomic conditions will shift the aggregate demand to the right or left, whether the aggregate demand will increase or decrease. And then you can show that decrease or increase in aggregate demand on this model of ADAS and work out that as compared to an imaginary initial assumed equilibrium, will your GDP, employment, income increase or decrease, and similarly will the economy's price levels, will they increase or decrease. Now obviously you can use all of this analysis to work out the changes in macroeconomic indicators due to these changes that impact your country's aggregate supply. So aggregate supply curve, remember again, it can only go right or left. It can either increase or decrease. So if the country's cost of production, let's say, falls, now if you have to work out what will be the impact on the macroeconomic indicators, then you again start off with an initial assumed equilibrium. Tell yourselves that if cost of production falls, maybe if the price of petrol or energy has gone down, then a reduction in the cost of production would mean that your country's aggregate supply curve will increase, it will shift to the right. So shift your aggregate supply curve to the right and read off from this graph that look, the economy will expand, the GDP will increase, and therefore employment will increase, and therefore the national income will increase, whereas the y-axis will tell you that in this new equilibrium, after the cost of production falls and short-run aggregate supply shifts to the right, the economy's price levels will also fall. You can do the same analysis to work out what will happen if the country gets more educated, or if the country's health increases, or if the country's infrastructure increases, because all of those are changes or increases, I should say, in quantity or quality of your country's resources. And we have already learned that if the quantity and quality of country's resources, or the state of technology, or the mobility of resources increase, then your productive capacity increases. And now if we have to work out, okay, how will the key macroeconomic indicators be affected? You just have to remind yourselves that as these things, changes in or increase in quantity, quality of country's resources, as that increases your country's potential output, its productive capacity, it will also mean that your country's short-run aggregate supply curve will increase, it will shift to the right. So start off with an assumed equilibrium of PL star, Y star, then increase and shift your short-run aggregate supply curve to the right, and read off from this graph that your economy will expand and the price levels will fall. And then the only other case that is left is that when the macroeconomic conditions change in a way because of which, let's say, the short-run aggregate supply curve decreases or shifts to the left. So maybe there is a civil war and your infrastructure gets destroyed. Maybe there is a reduction in the quality of your labor because of educated people leaving your country. Or maybe there is just an increase in cost of production, maybe because global oil prices increase. Now, if you have to work out the impact of all of these changes on the country's macroeconomy, all you need to remind yourselves is that, look, if the cost of production is increasing, or the quantity or quality of my country's resources for any reason is falling, then that means your productive capacity will decrease, your short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left, and then you can read off from the graph that as compared to this initial equilibrium, when your cost of production increases and short-run aggregate supply shifts to the left, the country's GDP will fall, the economy will shrink, therefore employment will fall, national incomes will fall, and the y-axis additionally tells you that the price levels in the economy will also increase. So in summary, the way you use this model of AD and AS, you need to be precise with your understanding of what will cause an increase or decrease in aggregate demand and what will cause an increase and decrease in aggregate supply. Once you know that, combine that knowledge with this imaginary technique where we just start off by assuming an initial imaginary equilibrium, PL star, Y star, with where AD and AS intersect. And then we just pick up what is changing in the economy, and then we work it out for ourselves that, okay, if these things are changing or maybe these things are changing, we just work out, will the aggregate supply shift or will the aggregate demand shift? In which direction will they shift? And then we can use this graph to work out what will happen to these key macro indicators of price levels and GDP and employment and income. So that is where we are saying this model of ADAS, it gives you a snapshot of the macroeconomy, and it is a powerful tool with which you can then work out the changes in the macroeconomic key indicators and the macroeconomic equilibrium as these macroeconomic conditions change. Now, I just want to end this video by giving you a couple of sort of situations where, sometimes macroeconomic conditions change in a way that both the aggregate demand as well as the aggregate supply changes. And I want you to be comfortable as to how would you work out the final impact on these macro indicators when you have things because of which both the short run aggregate supply as well as the aggregate demand of the country is going to change. Now, one such example is exchange rate. So let me just get rid of all of these things and let me give you an example of a macroeconomic change which will impact both the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply at the same time. So let's assume that your country's exchange rate depreciates. Now, we have already learned that if your country's exchange rate depreciates, and that means your exports will be cheaper, imports will be expensive, and therefore the net export component of your aggregate demand will increase and your entire aggregate demand will therefore shift to the right. So if exchange rates are falling, your net exports will increase and therefore your entire aggregate demand will shift to the right. But then you also have to remember that if your exchange rate is depreciating and your imports are becoming expensive, then that means that your country's cost of production will also increase, because many countries, they import oil or energy, which is the main source of input into all the production processes. So you reduce your exchange rate, aggregate demand will increase since your net exports will increase, but reduction in your exchange rate would also mean more expensive imported raw materials, and therefore your cost of production will also increase, which means what we are saying is that exchange rate depreciation, it will cause a shift of your aggregate demand to the right, and it will cause your aggregate supply to shift to the left. Now, this is where things get slightly more complicated. How can we now tell about the eventual impact on the price levels and GDP? Now, the easy way to do that is to first of all separately work out the impact of an increase in aggregate demand. So just shift your aggregate demand to the right and work out that because of this increase in aggregate demand, the GDP will increase and the price levels will also increase. And let's write that down. Because of the aggregate demand shift, the GDP will increase and the price levels will also increase. And then separately, assuming or beginning with an imaginary equilibrium, separately work out that, okay, what will be the impact of the shift left of the aggregate supply due to exchange rate depreciation. Now, to do that, shift your aggregate supply to the left and read off from your graph that your GDP will fall and the price levels in the economy will increase. And then note that down over here that because of the aggregate supply shift, your GDP will fall whereas your price levels will increase. And the combined eventual impact therefore of exchange rate depreciation would be that on the one hand, due to aggregate demand increasing, your GDP will tend to increase, whereas because of the aggregate supply shifting to the left, your GDP will tend to decrease. So you cannot say what will happen to your GDP. That depends on whether the shift of aggregate demand is more than the shift of aggregate supply or vice versa. Whereas if you look at the price levels, then price levels are increasing both because of this increase of aggregate demand as well as this increase of aggregate supply. So you can say that price levels will definitely increase when your exchange rates depreciate, whereas what happens to your GDP, that we cannot say, or we simply say that it is going to be ambiguous. We can't be sure because GDP, it is being pulled or being increased by the aggregate demand effect, but as it is being decreased by the aggregate supply effect, so we can't say what will be the eventual impact on your country's GDP. So this, remember, is where you have a situation where because of some change in the macroeconomy, both the AD and AS are changing and shifting at the same time. Work out the impact of AD change separately, work out the impact of AS change separately, and then see that if GDP is being pulled in opposite directions, then we can't say for sure where it will end up, whereas price levels, since it is being pulled in the same direction, we can be sure that it will increase. Now there can be other instances where both AD and AS may change at the same time, and one common reason why that happens or when that happens is when you see the government starts spending in order to try and increase the quantity or quality of its country's resources. So let's assume that the government spends on improving the education or the health or the infrastructure that is available in the economy. Now all of these things, an increase in health and education and infrastructure, it means that your country's quality of resources will increase, your potential output will increase, and therefore your short-run aggregate supply curve as well as your potential output should increase and shift to the right. However, you also have to remember that as the government starts spending on all the projects to make more schools and make more hospitals, then before these hospitals and schools are built and before you are able to educate and improve the quality of your labor, all of these things require time. You put children in school today, you at least have to keep on spending on them for, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years before they become well educated, better quality labor, and therefore your aggregate supply increases. But in the meantime, the immediate impact of all these policies is that since the government starts spending, the government spending increases. That is part of your country's aggregate demand. So initially, your country's aggregate demand will increase. So again, you have a situation where government is spending on education, health, etc. In the long term, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. This will happen when eventually your quality of resources increase because of all of these policies. But initially, as government spends more, the G component of aggregate demand and therefore the entire aggregate demand will increase and shift to the right. So the way you will analyze the eventual impact on the key macroeconomic indicators would be that, look, initially aggregate demand will increase and therefore, yes, your GDP will increase, but your economy will suffer from some inflation. But eventually, when the education, health and infrastructure improvements start showing their effects, and eventually when your country's quality of resources improve, then after some period of time, the short-run aggregate supply curve, it will shift to the right and the economy's GDP will increase and the price levels will fall. So long story short, let me sum this up. If there is some economic change because of which only aggregate demand or aggregate supply shifts, that is really easy. You just shift the relevant curve in the relevant direction and work out how the key macro indicators change. Whereas if there are things such as exchange rate changes or where the government starts spending on trying to improve the country's quality of resources, then both the aggregate demand and aggregate supply will be impacted at the same time. But that should not make your task of working out the impact on the macro indicators much more complicated. All you have to do is separately work out the impact on GDP and price levels because of aggregate demand shift, then separately work out the impact on macro variables because of aggregate supply shift, and then see if your price level is being pulled in the same direction by both AD-AS changes, then you know where your price level will go. If your AD and AS is pulling your price levels in opposite directions, you simply say that we can't say for sure what will happen to the price levels. And you do the same thing for the GDP. You just see if GDP is being pulled in the same direction by shifts of both AD and AS, then you know where your GDP will go. If on the other hand, your AD and AS are pulling your GDP in opposite directions, we simply say that we can't be sure as to what will happen to your country's GDP. So with that, as I said, I would highly recommend to go back and immediately look at the MCQs that I have collected for you on this topic of ADAS, which checks your understanding, which checks your skills of using all of these techniques and using this model of ADAS to work out the changes on the key macroeconomic indicators. Look at them, look at those MCQs right after this video so that these ideas are fresh in your mind and those MCQs will hopefully make a lot of sense to you.